Good morning. Hey, Dave. I'd like to welcome everyone this morning. I feel a little out of place because I had to grab this pulpit because the kids took the one to the teen class. So if we have a bad class, it's Nathan's fault. They took the pulpit. And I told them I would blame them for it right out of the chute. So glad everyone's here. Hope you all had a good week. Does anybody have any prayer requests before we begin? Will you bow with me, please? Our Father in heaven, we're so grateful for this time which we can study your word, that we can gather together as your children to learn more about you, to fellowship one with another, Father, and get to know each other better. Father, as we dig into your word, let's open our hearts and ears to what the Bible says to us, to become stronger and better Christians for thee. Father, we have a number of our family and friends who are struggling with illnesses. We have those who have lost loved ones. We ask that you strengthen them, comfort them as only you can. In Jesus' name, amen. We're in the book of Daniel still. We're finally in chapter 4. And this is kind of where Daniel really starts getting interesting. And I should have said it from the beginning of chapter 1. We really need to look at Daniel two ways to really understand it. We need to look at it with blinders on. We need to look at it as if we're Daniel and if we're Nebuchadnezzar in that point in time. We don't know anything that happened after that period of time. So we can put ourselves in their shoes, knowing the little bit that they knew. But now for our benefit, we need to look at it with the blinders off, with the understanding we know what the rest of the Bible says. We know what happened after their time period. We know what history says, so we can get a full understanding of what the story in Daniel's telling us. So we need to really look at it two ways. One, to get the feeling of them in the moment, and one for us to really understand what the Bible's telling us. So it's kind of hard to look at it two ways, but if you try to do that, I think you'll get a little bit more out of it, because I did. Because I tried to understand chapter 4 just of them in their shoes. And when I looked at it out of their shoes, it was like, wow, God is really talking to people here. So it's quite an interesting book, but we need a couple ways to really look at this. Any questions from what we've studied so far, chapters 1 through chapters 3? Basically, we've the initial story of, everybody knows in the Bible, from Daniel, the fiery furnace, and there was a dream there. Now we're getting into another part of the book that a lot of people haven't read, don't really know about. And it's another dream that Nebuchadnezzar has, that he's the king of Babylon. So if no questions or comments, we'll continue with Daniel chapter 4, we'll start off verses 1 through 3. Nebuchadnezzar the king to all the peoples, nations and men of every language that live in all the earth, may your peace abound. It has seemed good to me to declare the signs and wonders which the Most High, and the signs and wonders which the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs, how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. We know that Nebuchadnezzar serves many pagan gods, and he's proven this throughout. He even wanted people, the story of the fiery furnace, to bow down and worship an idol there. So he's truly not converted over to the one true God. He's still worshiping the pagan gods, but here in chapter 4 he starts off giving praise to God. And Babylon's a huge empire, and for the king to declare this praise to God, is he truly converted? Or is he just saying this, here's what this one God did, we're going to worship him along with all these other gods that I have? Daniel doesn't tell us here. And when he greets the people, it says, may your peace abound. That was a common greeting back then. May you be prosperous. It's like kind of day where we come up to somebody and say, hey, hi, how you doing? It was just a common greeting that they had back then that everybody just seemed to throw in. And as Nebuchadnezzar is praising God, he's talking about the signs and wonders that God personally performed for him. What was that? What was something that God personally performed for Nebuchadnezzar? Well, there was this one dream that hasn't come true yet, nothing's happened to it, but he had an interpretation there that Daniel gave to him, but we don't see any results of that interpretation. Then there's this fiery furnace deal that he wanted some people killed. But that's where he sees this miracle and this wonder where these men were kept alive through that. So he was a witness to that, so he's praising God for that. And then we saw that in chapter 3. And then as we continue on verse 3 in chapter 4 here, Nebuchadnezzar goes on to say, God's kingdom is everlasting. And this is actually paralleling what Daniel said in the interpretation of the king's dream in chapter 2. So we see chapter 2 and chapter 3 doing a little bit of parallel to each other, repeating some of the things that are going on. And Nebuchadnezzar is either remembering, recognizing some of the things that happened, he heard in chapter 2, as he's now making this declaration here in chapter 4. Yes, Bill? This is scratching your head. This is a question. So
you said that Daniel doesn't tell us, but right after Nebuchadnezzar said, I'm not going to spoil the story, but right after he says this, he has a dream, and that dream doesn't come up with a good ending.
no.
So I think in my mind, I think Nebuchadnezzar is just kind of parroting what he heard from the interpretation of the dream.
Right. That's where, like I start off, we got to look at what they know at that point in time. And then, difficult for us, we know the rest of the story, so it's hard to compartmentalize. But yes, at this point in time, he doesn't know the interpretation of the dream. It's going to come close, and yes. Whereas the first dream, we don't see any results of it yet. Nebuchadnezzar knew what the first dream was. Briefly, what was the first dream? What was that? About the different kingdoms. The statue that rose, different kingdoms, and the statue was crushed down. So none of that's happened yet. We know the end of it, but they don't back then. So there's been no results of that coming through yet. But as Bill was saying, in this dream, there's going to be almost instantaneous results when we get through the end of this chapter here. And we're going to see later on in chapter 4, if Nebuchadnezzar is consistent with the statement here as he's starting off praising God the Most High with all these miracles and wonders that he saw, and that God's domination and dominion is from generation to generation. His kingdom is everlasting. Does he stay true to what he's saying here in the beginning of chapter 4? Now we're going to get into the king's second dream. And remember, this is Nebuchadnezzar talking throughout the book of chapter 4 here. So he's starting off, and as we get into the next verses, you hear him say, I a lot. So that is him talking, him taking some credit, but it's him talking in the first person. We'll continue on with verses 4 through 18. I told Jason when we got here this morning that I was going to bring notes for chapter 4 and chapter 5. I left chapter 5 at home, folks, so you better have some questions. So, only got notes for chapter 4 here today, and I don't think we're even going to get anywhere near ending chapter 4. So, but it's an interesting chapter, and it's a good chapter. Verses 4 through 18. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream, and it made me fearful. And these fantasies, I lay on my bed, and my visions in my mind kept alarming me. So I gave orders to bring into my presence all the wise men of Babylon, that they may make known to me the interpretations of my dream. And then the magicians, the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners came in, and I related the dream to them, but they could not make its interpretation known to me. But finally, Daniel came in before me, whose name is Belshazzar, according to the name of my God, and in whom is a spirit of the holy gods, and I related the dream to him, saying, O Belshazzar, chief of the magicians, since I know that a spirit of the holy gods is in you, and no mystery baffles you, tell me the visions of my dream which I have seen, along with its interpretations. Now these were the visions in my mind. As I lay on my bed, I was looking, and behold, there was a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew large and became strong, and its height reached to the sky, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth. Its foliage was beautiful, and its fruit was abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, the birds of the sky dwelt in its branches, and all living creatures fed themselves from it. I was looking in the vision in my mind as I lay on my bed, and behold, an angelic watcher, a holy one, descended from heaven. He shouted out and spoke as follows: Chop down the tree and cut off its branches. Strip off its foliage and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts flee from under it and the birds from its branches. Yet leave the stump with its roots in the ground, but with a band of iron and bronze around it, in the new grass of the field, and let it be drenched with the dew of heaven. And let him share with the beasts in the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let the beast's mind be given to him. And let 7 periods of time pass over him. This sentence is by the decree of the angelic watchers, and the decision is a command of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind, and bestows on it whom he wishes, and sets over it the lowliest of men. This is a dream which I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now you, Belshazzar, tell me its interpretation, inasmuch none of the wise men of my kingdom is able to make known to me the interpretation, but you are able, for the spirit of the holy gods is in you. This dream starts off pretty nice. This tree in the center of the earth grows up. It comes up, it gets huge, it gets beautiful. Everyone can see it. It's in the center of the earth. It gets so large. So far, not a bad dream. But before the dream, Nebuchadnezzar starts off talking about how things are going well for him. You know, he's at ease in his house and flourishing in his palace. When he started off as king, he was a younger man. Some years have passed. He may have had some wars, some conflicts going on that the kingdom might have had struggling. But right now, things are going very well for him. He's happy. He's prosperous. So things are good for him personally and for his kingdom. Now, could this be because he might have had a change of heart and these blessings are coming from God? The book doesn't say. But now when he has this dream is different than the first one. The first one, he lost sleep. This dream, he's troubled and fearful. So, is he older, wiser? The thoughts of what this dream, him to understand, is he got a little better comprehension? We don't know. The book doesn't say. But we know that he was extremely troubled. And what did he do in this dream like he did in the last one? Called in his wise men. And we know how that turned out last time. But last time when he called in the wise men, he gave them an ultimatum. You tell me what my dream is, you tell me what my interpretation is, or you and your family are going to be eliminated. He didn't do that this time. He approaches completely differently. So, did he become a little more tactful? Did he become a little more wise? Possibly. So the king Nebuchadnezzar might be learning from some of his past mistakes. And this is all we're learning from him by him wanting to know about a dream, an interpretation of a dream. So the wise men come in, like they did last time, and we thought he would have called in Daniel, but Daniel is a higher up, he's in charge of the wise men. He was probably out doing something for the king himself, so more than likely Daniel wasn't around at this point in time in the city when the king called him. He was probably out. Nothing here says that, but chances are he was out, because I would assume Daniel would have come when everyone was called in. The king calls him in, he tells him the dream in verse 7, same as last time. You know, they couldn't tell him. They could not tell him what the dream meant. They were at a loss. Why would that be? They didn't have God on their side, exactly. I was going to say they didn't have God's help. I mean, Daniel was able to tell the king the dream and its interpretation. Prayed to God, God gave Daniel the information. These men here don't have God on their side. If they would have gave an answer, they would have been shooting from the hip and guessing, and chances are they would have been wrong, and that wouldn't have been a good situation for them. But Daniel had God on his side. He trusted in God. We saw that he's been faithful through the whole book so far, and I don't see that changing. And Daniel would be able to answer this when he finally comes before the king. Verses 8 and 9, we see Daniel coming. And it says, but finally, Daniel came. It's almost like he was anticipating, waiting. I know Daniel's out, but I want to know what this dream is, so I'll call on the wise men. Oh, they can't answer it. And he's sitting there in the castle, tapping his hands, waiting for Daniel. He hears that Daniel's in the city, and Daniel's before him. And finally, Daniel arrives. It's like he's very anxious, awaiting for this, because he wants to know, what does this dream mean? Because this dream is completely different than the last one. Any questions so far? Yes, Brett?
Don't you think a lot of these other guys were probably afraid to say anything too, because that they really, we all know they really could predict the future and tell it. So they use trickery and things like that to feed off the king kind of what he wanted to hear. Well, when they come across Daniel and he was able to interpret the truth. Well, don't you think some of them probably, they might have had an idea what they wanted to say, but didn't say it because they're like, no, like, he's going to come in and tell us really what it means, and it's not going to be right. What we say is not going to be right, so it's better to just say we don't know.
That could be. Because we know the king trusted Daniel in his interpretation because what Daniel did before. And the king himself said Daniel was 10 times better than these folks. But, as Brett's saying, they could have come up with a story, could have guessed it right and said it. But when Daniel comes in, if it contradicted what they say, it wouldn't look good for them. And they could be fearful of the answer that they would have gave.
Because I think what they probably were back then is kind of similar to what like modern day psychics are. You know what I mean? It's kind of
they can't interpret. I mean, us knowing the story, but even if we kind of put the blinders on, okay, you see this tree in the center of the earth that grew huge and big. Well, Babylon, kind of in the center over there, became this big empire. So logically, one could say, you're the tree, king. But you look at the rest of the story, you just got cut down, king. You wouldn't want to be the guy saying that to him. So if they had a hint that it might have been him, they could be thinking it's very detrimental for me to say, I really think you're the tree, but I really think you're going to get cut down. So, don't know what was in the wise men's minds at that point, but if they did have a inkling of what it meant, they might have been fearful of telling the king their interpretation of that dream, fearful of what the king might say or do, because if they're wrong, he wouldn't, trust them anymore. But if they were right, it doesn't look good for what's going to happen to the king. So they could be very well fearful of their response in one way or the other. Anything else? Great comment, Brett. That's one of the things I was thinking too. Why wouldn't they say it if they knew something? Out of fear. Because Nebuchadnezzar has shown in the past, he gives knee-jerk reactions to things that he doesn't like. And it's not, well, we'll toss you in prison and think about it, we're just going to kill you and move on. And he did a lot of knee-jerk reactions, and this might have been one as well if he would have got a response that he didn't like the answer to. Let's continue on. So when Daniel gets there, the king, what does he do? He says, hey, Daniel, come here, I got something to tell you. Nope. He calls him Belshazzar. And what's that name? That's the name that the king gave him when Daniel and his friends became captives. And that name is after one of Nebuchadnezzar's gods. The god was Marduk, which means Bel protect his life. That's the name and interpretation that Daniel was given. Bel, named after the god Marduk, and Belshazzar came from Bel, which in the interpretation is protect his life. So that's kind of, Daniel, protect my life. That's kind of the interpretation of his new name there. And that's what he calls him. He's calling him Belshazzar when he comes into him, not Daniel. And the king believes that Daniel has the power of the spirits of the gods. He's not referring to the God of Most High. He's believing it's the gods that he worships, the pagan idols, the pagan gods that Nebuchadnezzar and his people worship. That's who, down deep, Nebuchadnezzar believes, and why Daniel has all this power. That he can understand, and that there's no mystery that confuses him or baffles him. He can tell these interpretations. And it's like Nebuchadnezzar has forgotten what Daniel has already done for him, and how Daniel gave God the Most High all the credit for everything that he has said and done. And Nebuchadnezzar seems to have forgotten that at this point. So the king goes on in verse 10, and he's telling Daniel what the dream is, and he basically reiterates everything that he tells us. The king, he grows up in the middle of the earth. It grew large. Its height was great. And in dream 1, there was a statue. It was large. The king later on built a statue that was large. Any correlation there? Maybe, maybe not. But we see something big and massive in this tree that is growing. And as the story goes on, its leaves and foliage were beautiful. It was something good to look upon. And there was food for all coming off of this tree. So everybody was able to live off of it, eat off it, be sustained off it. The tree was so big, there was shade for all the animals to be underneath it. The branches could hold all the birds. That tree was able to sustain life for everything that's going on in that area there. And all living things fed from it. That's how, in this dream, this big this tree was. So far, it sounds like a good dream, doesn't it? I see nothing wrong with this dream so far. It sounds pretty good if you're having this dream. But it's going to take a pretty sharp twist. Knowing what we know about the Bible, if you know the rest of the story, what else does this tree sound like? What else is so big that all men see, that sustains all life, that all things can live off of it, All things are protected from it. Sounds like Christ. I'm not saying that this tree in this story is Christ. But Christ, the whole world sees, the whole world feeds off him. He's the bread of life. We all get our sustenance from him. We get all our protection from him. And he can save all things. This story, that tree is not Christ. We'll see later on, as we get into verse 13 of that, who or what this tree is. In verse 13, we see that the king, as he was looking, there was an angelic watcher from heaven came down. A lot of people are saying it was an angel, or some people are saying it was a divine being. We only can go by what the Bible here says. It's an angelic watcher came down, and at that point it says, chop down the tree. This massive tree that was providing shade and food and shelter, he's saying, cut it down. But not only cut it down, cut off all its branches, strip all the foliage off it, and scatter all its fruit. Basically, destroy this tree, destroy this massive, beautiful thing that's here in the center of the earth that all can see. Destroy it. And as you do this, let the beasts that are near it flee from it, and the birds that are on the branches flee from it as well. And the phrase chop down and cut off isn't just literally cut it into little pieces. It's indicated that this tree and all the provisions that are on it are going to be brought to an end. It's going to be completely destroyed. That's the type of destruction that's going to happen to this tree. And as we saw in his first dream, there was utter destruction happening to the kingdoms that were listed in the interpretation of that dream as well. One started and it ended. Another started and it ended. Another started and it ended. This tree grew so large, it was cut down, and its sustenance was taken from it, and the provisions coming from it was brought to an end. But if you're getting a tree removed at your yard and you want it completely gone, what do? You cut down the tree, you remove the wood, whether you burn it, do whatever. What's left? The stump. You dig and dig to get the stump out. You have somebody come in, grind it up. You just want that stump gone, because if not, it's going to be a hindrance. It may come back. You don't know what's going to happen. But the angel at this time didn't say remove the stump. It didn't say dig up the roots. It said, at this stump, put a band around it. Put an iron and bronze band around it. What would that do to a stump of a tree if you did that in your backyard? You cut a tree down and you put something around it, around the stump. It would protect it. It would protect it from things coming from the outside. It would protect it from some of the elements trying to get to it and deteriorate it. So that stump was protected. The roots were left intact into the ground. This tree has a shot of coming back. And the angel made sure that that stump was protected by that band. So the tree would not be completely destroyed. It has a shot to come back and grow again. And it goes on to say in verse 15, the angel was saying, let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him share with the beasts of the field. This just took a different twist. Bill's smiling over there. He sees what it is. What just happened here in chapter 4 in this story?
Change pronouns.
It changed pronouns. It went from a tree to, in verse 15, him, to a person. It's a very pivotal point in this story here. And at this point, when Nebuchadnezzar was telling the dream, did it click in his mind that it went from an object to a person? Don't know. I'm sure he was a very smart man. But did he catch on in this dream? The angel said, leave the stump, protect it, but then let him be drenched in the dew of heaven. Don't know if Nebuchadnezzar picked up on that. But this is where the story starts getting good. And in verse 16, any comments so far? I haven't lost anybody by going from a tree to a him, have we? I mean, nowadays, people go from him to her to that to this in a heartbeat. But this is completely different here. This is completely different. verse 16, excuse me, and there's other descriptives here about a man, and it says, his mind changed. So we're now on the person. Let his mind change from that of a man to that of a beast. So, and we're not specifically talking about the mind itself here. You can look at other translations. Instead of being mind, it's saying heart. So this man, his heart, he's going to become and start acting like a beast of the field. And it goes on to say, 7 periods of time pass. Verse 16. Let 7 periods of time pass over him. And we've talked about this number 7 before, where in the fiery furnace heated up 7 times hotter. Make it as hot as you can. Forgive somebody 7 times 70. It's not 490 times. It's infinity at that point. But this ain't saying for infinity. This isn't saying it's 7 days. It's not saying it's 7 weeks, 7 months, 7 years. It is saying 7 periods of time. We can only assume it's going to be a period of time long enough for whoever this him is to learn their lesson. Could it be 7 hours? Possibly. Could it be 7 days, weeks, months, years? Possibly. We know it's 7 periods of time. Could it be 7 full seasons going through? It could be 7 full cycles. Likely, from what I've been reading, most commentators are saying it's likely 7 full seasons or approximately 7 full years because of what happens to the person in this dream later on. But there is nothing specific that I have read in the Bible or commentators saying it is exactly this period of time. We just know it's 7 periods of time. Does anybody have any input on those 7 periods that I might have missed? And I'm looking to 2 people specifically. Okay. But we know it's long enough, as we know the rest of the story with our blinders off, that after that 7 periods of time, this person has learned their lesson. And 7 periods of time is repeated in chapter 4. We read it here in verse 16. It's repeated in verse 23. It's repeated in verse 25. It's repeated in verse 32. So it's 7 periods of time in each of those instances as this story in this dream is continued through the chapter here in chapter 4. And the sentence that is by the angelic watchers that we see in verse 17, that it's the decree of the angelic watchers, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are the ones that made this decree. They're just announcing it. They're the messenger. They're not the one that made this decree what it is. They are the ones that are bringing the message to what happens to this tree and what's going to happen to this person. And it just goes to show that God is in control at all times, as we're reading verse 17 as well. And he appoints who he wishes to rule, who he wishes to take out, which we've read before in earlier chapters in Daniel, that God is always the one that's in control here. And Nebuchadnezzar was saying, who's the one that can take you out of my hand, when referring to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Well, it was God that saved them. It wasn't Nebuchadnezzar that was saying, I can do what I want here and nobody has a say in it. God's the one that had to say that these men are going to live. They're not going to die by your hand. So God is always in control, and that's something we always need to remember, that things might not be going our way, but God has a plan, and we need to try to understand what his plan is. In verse 18, Nebuchadnezzar is ending his dream. It says, this is the dream which, here he goes again, I, Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. So he's putting not just I, but I, the king, have seen. So he's saying, this is it. I mean, here is what I dreamed. Now he puts it all back on Daniel. Now you, Belshazzar, tell me its interpretation. I mean, and he admits, Nebuchadnezzar admits, none of my wise men can do it. But he truly believes that Daniel can do it, because he ends up at the end of verse 18, for a spirit of the holy gods is in you. As misdirected as Nebuchadnezzar is, by him saying that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, he's right to a point. God is in Daniel, not the gods that Nebuchadnezzar's thinking. So he's misdirected at that point. And if God will allow Daniel to tell Nebuchadnezzar what this dream means, nothing's going to stop that from happening. And as blinders off, we know what's going to happen in the rest of the story, that God does allow Daniel to have the information and knowledge to interpret what this dream is. Any thoughts of what you might think this dream is or means? Something like that? Before we get to Daniel's interpretation, we'll see how right or wrong people might be. I can't give the answer because I read the story. Ted.
I'm not saying definitive here, but one possibility of the seven being used is simply the idea that seven in the Bible is complete, whether it's the 7 days of, in Genesis chapter 1, whether it's, 7 times 7, those are all complete. The Bible uses that number, and it might be saying it is going to be a complete period of time of which God knows that, and when it happens, it happens. It might not be even years or anything, but simply until it happens.
That makes good sense with what we know about this story, because we know after that 7 periods of time, something is going to happen, and the completeness happens, and then we see what happens with or to Nebuchadnezzar. So that the word complete, just finding a time period, it makes great sense.
Other places in Daniel and the Revelation, and even other places, use things like times, and half times, which is half a 7. They use, so many days, and those are all equivalent to a period of unknown time also. So that's the only thing I can think of is why that might be used.
That makes great sense, and it's reading through it. I like how you use the word complete, because it does do that. We see, the beginning of time, after 7 days, things were complete. There's 7 there in that. So, great comment. Anything else? Bill?
So while you were talking, I have a Bible app, and I was going through the different translations. And all of them did it as periods of time, and only the NIV puts a footnote in there's possibly 7 years.
Yeah.
So your study, you didn't find it in your studies. So
No. I mean, commentators assumed it was 7 years because they're saying everything else was too short. That was their reasoning for it. Weeks, months was too short for what we hear through the rest of the story of a time period.
But like Ted says, a year might have been enough for
Mhm.
him. It was complete.
What is the time period, right? So, anything before we move on? Any thoughts of what this story means? This dream means? I mean, an initial thought is, Nebuchadnezzar's a guy he's the tree. And he's going to get cut down, wiped out, end of him. That's what it sounds like, but then when you start getting into, he's going to have the heart and mind of a beast, an animal of the field, of cattle. It's like, I don't know what that means. I don't understand it. Let's gloss over it, and okay, chapter 5. Well, we can't do that. This is what the story's about for us now. We got the build up to it. Now let's see what this means. We can get a better understanding of kind of why Nebuchadnezzar is kind of very fearful and what's going to possibly happen to him or whoever this tree is. Yes, Bill? You going to say something? Go ahead. You won't ruin it.
But Nebuchadnezzar's forgetful.
Oh, very much so.
Because he's going to be told this. It's going to be 12 months, and then he's back to his old self. When I first said it's immediately happens, it doesn't immediately happen, but pretty quick. It's 12 months, and then all of a sudden, he's back to his old.
Me.
Yeah.
I mean, like I started off the story, yes, he was the first, we're seeing the story told so far in the first person. Nebuchadnezzar saying, Nebuchadnezzar, I this, I that, this happened to me, I. And eventually in this story it's going to change. It's no longer going to be I. He's going to tell it, and the story's going to be told in the third person is how he's telling it. Then it's going to wrap up. Him going again, I. Being told in the first person. So that's what's very interesting about chapter 4 here, and how this dream and story is all being told, including the interpretation from Daniel. It's, when you hear the interpretation from Daniel, it's still Nebuchadnezzar reciting what Daniel's saying to him. Anything else before we move on? Let's talk about the interpretation of this vision. Verses 19 through 27. Then Daniel, whose name is Belshazzar, was appalled for a while, and his thoughts alarmed him. The king responded and said, Belshazzar, do not let the dream or its interpretation alarm you. Belshazzar answered and said, My lord, if only the dream applied to those who hate you, and its interpretation to your adversaries. That the tree you saw, which became large and grew strong, whose height reached the sky and was visible to all the earth, whose foliage was beautiful and its fruit abundant, and in which was food for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and whose branches the birds of the sky lodged, it is you, O king. For you have become great and grown strong, and your majesty has become great and reached the sky, and your dominion to the end of the earth. And in that the king saw an angelic watcher, a holy one, descending from heaven, saying, Chop down the tree and destroy it, yet leave the stump with its roots in the ground, and with a band of iron and bronze around it and new grass of the field, and let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him share with the beasts of the field until 7 periods of time passed. This is the interpretation, O king. This is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king, that you be driven away from mankind, and your dwelling place be with the beasts of the field, and you be given grass to eat like cattle, and be drenched with the dew of heaven. And 7 periods of time will pass over you until you recognize that the Most High is ruler all of the realm of mankind, and bestows on it whomever he wishes. And in that it was commanded to leave the stump with the roots of the tree. Your kingdom will be assured to you after you recognize that it is heaven that rules. Therefore, O king, my advice be pleasing to you. Break away now from your sins by doing righteousness, and from your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, in case there may be a prolonging of your prosperity. As much faith as Daniel has in God kind of put a lump in his throat when he was about to tell the interpretation of this dream. Not that he was fearful of his life, but it sounds like Daniel truly cared for the king. And not only for that, knowing what this dream means, that Nebuchadnezzar is going to be pulled from power, which means somebody else is going to be in power. What's going to happen to Daniel's people? What's going to happen to the Jews at this time period? Even though Nebuchadnezzar was a knee-jerk reaction king, he could be a terrible king at one time. We saw him wanting to kill people at the drop of a hat. The Jews didn't have it too awful bad underneath him. It was tolerable. And Daniel knew how they were being treated. So in the back of his mind, he's also thinking, when he's out of power, what's going to happen to my people? What's going to happen to the Jews? What's going to happen to me and my friends? Not that he's worried about their lives, but their overall treatment of what's going on here. So he's probably torn in a couple of different ways. His concern for the king and his concern for the Jews. So he had to take a minute before he gave the answer to this question. What does this dream mean? And, apparently he had this look on his face. And, when we're reading in verse 19, and his thoughts were alarmed, and it was enough that the king said to him, hey, don't let this bother you. I mean, when Daniel heard it, did he have this look on his face? Did his face drop, his eyes pop up like, oh boy, this ain't going to be good? Something had to be going on for the king to pick up on that. And Nebuchadnezzar saying, don't let it bother you. Just tell me what it is. And we see Daniel go on and say, boy, this ain't going to be good. If whatever's happening here, he's saying, summarizing here, I wish it wasn't happening to you. I wish it was happening to your adversaries and those who hate you. Because, king, this ain't going to be good. You're not going to like this. It's not going to be what's going to be good what's happening to you. So Daniel is kind of, I don't want to say torn, but he's getting emotional here because of what's going to truly happen to the king, somebody he cared about, and what could possibly happen to the Jews under this possibly new person who's going to come in control. And then Daniel describes, I'm not going to go in detail of everything, he describes the dream again, talk about how big the tree is, how good it was, how everything was underneath it, doing so well. Describing the kingdom of Babylon, how it was little, came up and became so big. And at one point he says, King, that tree's you. So far, so good. But the king knows the rest of the story. The king knows that tree's going to get cut down. And he's just been told by somebody that has interpreted another dream for him, somebody that he trusts. The king Nebuchadnezzar trusts Daniel in his interpretation. That tree is you. And that king, your dominion is extended to the ends of the earth. That's how powerful and large the Babylonian Empire was back then. It was one of the biggest in that area, one of the most powerful at that point in time. And he's just been told, he's going to be told, it's going to come to an end. Perfect words to end on. We will pick up verses, we'll start at 20 again, next week. Any comments before we end here? If you have a chance, read the end of chapter 4. It's very interesting. And it's well worth it. Yes, Ted?
Did everybody think this week about the two different dreams in a way that, I don't know, I haven't always, they have something in common.
Yes.
God has control over the kingdoms of the earth. Not only is this pointing towards Jesus, which all the Old Testament does, but in a physical sense, God has control over political things. Okay? The first one is long-term because it tells from the time period of when they're living until the time period of Christ, which is several hundred years. And the second one is short-term, what's going to happen to an individual king. I don't think we often look at what happens around the world from God's point of view like that.
In dovetailing on what Ted said, in this book so far we've heard that Daniel said that God brings in kingdoms and he brings in rulers. That's talking about individuals, as Ted mentioned, and kingdoms, nations, as Ted was saying. So it's political if we can look at our day and age as well. And so it's the first part of Daniel is going along with this story here too. As Ted said, the first dream was about kingdoms. This one is now about an individual ruler, how we went from a tree to describing to a him, to a person, of what's going to be happening to the specific king here, Nebuchadnezzar. Hope I didn't take away anything from what Ted said. Anything else? Thanks for being here.